QSO Today, episode 437, Jim Aspinwall, NO1PC. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts Magazine. Save the date for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, March 25th and 26th, 2023, UDT. Follow the link to the Expo website for more information. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Tickets for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo are on sale now. While the theme of the next expo is New Amateur License, Now What?, I want to stress that we need all of you to come to the expo to support the new or returning hams that we hope will come to the expo. It takes all of us to share our experience and expertise to build a stronger community that includes these new hams. Please buy a ticket for the expo and encourage your ham friends, especially those that are not on the air, to explore it with us. The amazing opportunities that exist now in our hobby demonstrated by the presentations at the expo. Your ticket purchase helps to support not only the expo and make it possible, but this QSO Today podcast itself. See you at the expo. Jim Aspinwall, NO1PC, was the fly on the wall as a kid growing up in Madison, Wisconsin, listening to his dad and friends talk about electronics, radio, and television repair. This led to a hands-on electronics education that kept Jim employed from junior high school to this day. As a public safety volunteer, Jim believes that giving back to the community is key to a happy life. Amateur radio and all of its benefits, then, is the icing on Jim's cake of life. NO1PC is my QSO Today. NO1PC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jim?
Hello, Eric. NO1PC. I'm here.
Hey, Jim, thanks for joining me at the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, my earliest recollection was probably a field day that my dad took me to when I was 5 or 6. What little I remember about that, some of the local hams remember even better because I was a little terror that made noise and pulled on wires, and people were wondering, why doesn't 80 meters work anymore? Oh, well, little Jimmy was up on top of the RV playing with things or pulled something out of the tree. So I got a very early start in how not to get into trouble at field day.
Your QRZ page says that your father was a ham, and you're alluding to this now. What was your father's name, and what was his call sign?
He's Bill Aspinwall. His call sign is, as it was issued in 1951, W9UGT.
Is your father still around?
He is still around.
Still on the air?
A little bit. He's in managed care, and they're trying to figure out how to get an HF rig or a 2-meter rig in his facility so he can hook up. Provided him an all-star node, so we can try that. My brother is also a ham, so he's helping out with some of those arrangements on that end back in Wisconsin.
What was the hometown?
Madison, Wisconsin.
And you were there most of your growing up life?
I was there till probably 20 or 21, yes.
And so how did this relationship with the Madison hams and your father, how did that evolve? Were you the terror for many years, or did you at some point just kind of submit?
Well, I was a tag-along. A lot of the local hams were wondering every year as things progressed, as I became more literate and, a little more responsible and less reckless. Why don't you get your license? Your dad's a ham. You surround yourself with hams. Why aren't you more involved in this? And I don't know why I resisted. My dad did not offer any help, and there weren't really classes. Most people were self-taught at that point, and had to seek out a ham. And there was a very good radio club in town that would have provided for it, but I just didn't know where to go and just didn't think to ask my dad, hey, I want to get involved with this. I think I didn't understand the requirements until later. what was needed, and maybe I didn't feel I was up to it technically, because I was tinkering in the basement and abusing his shop. He would frequently have the neighbors would bring over their television set and have him fix it, and so I'd sit there and watch him use the tube checker and all that. Finally, by about the time I was 12, Dad figured out I knew how to take TVs apart and use the tube checker. So when the neighbor would come over with a TV and a six-pack of beer, the TV was left with me and the six-pack of beer disappeared with them until I came out and said the set was fixed. Learned by observation and tinkering, and I did quite a bit of tinkering, but it really didn't hit home until I got into high school. We had shop class, and of course, one of my favorite shop classes was electronics, and that drove home the whole point. We had a very nice new station in the classroom, and but it took about a year before everybody said, you're playing with too much ham radio piggybacking on the high school station's license. We're going to have a little novice class and get a couple of you guys licensed finally.
So this was done in the school. I remember also being in high school in the early 70s, and I think every public school had a ham radio station of some kind.
Almost every. I think a couple of the high schools in town did. I was fortunate, so was the school, that it was basically a brand new high school a couple of years before I got into it. So every new teacher picked to work there, especially in the shop class, basically had an open slate to work with to build up their lab equipment, decide what it was going to, what the layout was going to be. And our electronics instructor had worked his way through teaching school, working in a Motorola two-way radio service station. And so when he equipped, and I don't know how he was aware of amateur radio, but you walked into the classroom, he had given up half his office space to equip both a novice and a general plus, two separate ham stations in half his office. There was a 40-foot tower with a tri-bander and a 40-meter beam on the gymnasium roof, and a dipole and a couple of 2-meter antennas. There was a built-in brand new education-funded ham shop in there. And as well, because of his two-way background and there were work-study programs, he decided to equip 2 lab benches in the back of the shop. One was a typical stereo TV workbench, so we learned about color burst and how to fix color TVs, if that was your path and where you wanted to go work. And the other part of that lab was what I call a mini Motorola service station. Signal generator, frequency counter, all the gewgaws, Motorola test set, big power supply, all the control cables for whatever radio you wanted to bring in and put on the bench. And I said, that's my bench. Somehow that just became my bench. And this was at a time in ninth grade, probably not so much getting involved in that, but that would have been about the right time.
You mentioned in your QRZ page that you were converting a lot of T43 GGTs for hams in Madison so that they could get on the 2-meter FM repeater. I thought that was very cool. That was my first mobile radio as well. But I thought it was interesting that you were not even having a ham radio license yet, working on these mobile trunk mount tube type mobile radios that were quite common in the early 70s.
Yeah, for 20, the local cab company had upgraded its fleet, and the Motorola service station had this pile of radios they needed to get rid of, so they sold them to the local hams for $25, and then provided everybody had to figure out, go to International, Crystal, or Bomar to order a rock, and then of course they were up at 153, so they didn't work too well at 146 megahertz. So somebody had to take out a dozen coils and replace the capacitors to downband them so they would work. And that was me. I probably put more people on 2-meter FM in Wisconsin than anybody I know.
I remember there was a Motorola Red book that had the schematics of all of those. So you could actually see on the schematic what parts you needed to change in order to change the band spread for those radios.
Yeah, exactly. It made it easy. So through the school, there was a standard stockpile of the conversion kit, which had all the capacitors laid out. You knew exactly. We had plenty of capacitors in stock to do that.
So that explains why you have access to the bench, is because you actually had a bench where you could actually work on these radios for people. So you became a supplier or a converter of 2-meter radios for the Madison ham community. And what happened after that?
Well, as part of that, the instructor said, "This is nonsense. Everybody in town knows your voice when you come on the air to test their radios." A couple other classmates wanted to get their license as well, so we did a little novice class. Then we had one of the older hams in town was an examiner. I don't know exactly the construct at that point, but a couple of us got a ride over to Chuck Deal's house and sat in his little basement, took our 5-word-a-minute code test, and then took our written exam and waited and waited and waited, and finally a WN9 GVF showed up in the mail, and that was kind of cool. I didn't have any gear, and I couldn't exactly use my dad's 100-watt VFO-driven radio, at least not legally. Borrowed a DX40 from another friend. I think I made all of 7 novice contacts from home. From there, focused on the tech exam. And that next summer, the electronics instructor also had remote exam privileges. So I sat my technician test at his kitchen table. He lived about 4 blocks from us. Waited and waited, and suddenly WN9 GVF became WB9 GVF, and it all started at that point.
How old were you?
14, yeah. It was 1971 when 71, 72 when I went through that process.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made then for your education and career?
I think it was inevitable. It was just it was a natural gravitation. I don't think I knew anything else. We didn't dabble in plumbing at home, and a little bit of carpentry. So being a Midwest kid, kind of a jack of all trades. I do a lot of my own handiwork and home improvement and some cabinet making and stuff at home. But electronics was the natural place to be. It just rang true with me somehow. I never felt I was smart enough to try and pursue it in college and get a degree because I was happy working with my hands, and I had good job opportunities that provided a lot of that advanced education.
What did your father do, out of curiosity?
Well, after the Air Force, I think he came back from, he got into radio television repair. For a while, he was a dispatcher for Wisconsin State Patrol.
So he was involved in radio professionally, or involved in electronics and radio professionally.
Yeah, I remember hanging out at one of the TV repair shops, with him. He worked at one of the local electronics suppliers, which was also the local ham radio store. Every Saturday, he would go out to visit his buddies, and I'd be running down the driveway going, "I want to go." So he let me in the car, and we went off to Satterfield Electronics, hung out in the ham store part of that, and I got to walk the whole store. I learned about capacitors, nuts, bolts, knobs, switches, what kind of solder, just all kinds of things. That was sort of like going to the zoo. I get to pet all the electronic animals.
What do you remember about that?
It was special time with Dad. It was being in an environment with adults. I think on the grayish side of things, I was never an athletic kid. I was always kind of geeky, always kind of picked on. And so this was, a non-biased, non-pick-on, just a welcoming opportunity, as long as I didn't get myself in trouble and pull down a shelf full of parts, which never happened. But it was time with Dad, and learning from his friends and trying to figure out how Dad learned things, what his relationship with them was. So that kind of interaction was just part of growing up. Just like probably like some kids going to Little League. My Little League field was a ham store.
Was do it yourself, whether it was the electronics or the plumbing or the carpentry or whatever, was that something that most people did in those days?
I would say it's probably a 30 to 50% split. You're in the Midwest. A lot of folks are from a rural background, either supplying things to the rural environment or actually being there, self-sufficient. So I did learn how to milk a cow when I was 10. New milk pails were too heavy. It was, mucking around a barn was not for me. It was a little dirty. Madison being the epicenter of the University of Wisconsin, which has got a tremendous history in medical education, engineering, all kinds of sciences. there was a tremendous wealth of information available, however that happened. But most people were, we're talking the 60s. Certainly there were those people who, didn't know a screwdriver from a hacksaw and, were always calling a handyman. Those were the fancy people. And then there were, the grassroots people that said, okay, got to replace some shingles on the roof, or the siding's got a hole in it or something,
Right, you just did it.
Yeah.
As you got through high school and started into adulthood, what did you like to operate on ham radio? Where did you hang out?
Well, it was mostly 2 meters. After I got my tech, this was just at the time when 2 meter repeaters were happening.
Were just happening.
There were probably earlier ones in California than we got to them. But aside from HF, there was a lot of the local communications, what was then the Aries Red Cross stuff, was done on 29620 AM with Johnson Messenger 1, 2, or 3, 2-type CB-like radios. So they were maybe 5-6 watts, crystal controlled. And I don't know how long that lasted. I know Dad had one in his car, and I think another one at the house. Then Heathkit came out with the Tour, which was a 2 meter radio kit that had 2 watts, maybe 5 watts AM, and the locals tried to dabble with 144.1 or something as the local simplex alternative to 10 meters. And I think part of that drive was propagation was changing. 10 meters was more skip than it was local, or whatever the motivation was. And that didn't last too long before FM came along and this fleet of 2 meter radios happened.
The fleet of 2 meter radios might have driven the FM conversion. I mean, all of a sudden there's a plentiful, large group of radios.
I think it was kind of a perfect storm. I think folks had learned that people in Chicago and or Milwaukee were playing with it. I don't know how 2 meter FM came into the picture, but certainly the availability of radios facilitated that. There was one group of two-way radio shop people that determined to build one of the first 2 meter FM repeaters, located it in a hotel, at the top of a hotel in downtown Madison. I don't remember how we got involved in that, but everybody was crystalling their radios up for, I think the simplex frequency at the time was 146.94, and then maybe one of the repeaters. And this was before real band planning and standardization. No, there was no ARRL band plan, no concerted frequency coordination situation going on at all. So 9.4 was it for simplex, and this other group had come up with 146.46, 146.88 is their repeater pair. And so everybody crystalled for that. And then one of the local hams who was not an engineer, he was in fact one of the more popular local rock station DJs. He was a very outgoing character, very driven. There's some relationship with a couple of engineering students, electrical engineering students out of University of Wisconsin, that determined, well, we want to build a repeater too. And so that got driven, and the 3476 repeater came to be in that situation. And luckily, one of the engineering students that got involved in that project did some internship work at Motorola in Schaumburg, Illinois. So he was working on the transition from Motrac receivers into what became the Mycore receiver, and was able to get some experimental equipment from Motorola to start building this repeater system with. And so I sort of became one of I think I was the 13th charter member of that organization as it was being built. And they were designing their own little controller. They were hand building DTMF decoders. So we had control.
They didn't take their DTMF decoders from Western Electric key telephone systems like the 247B?
No, those were not on the street at the time. So it was a lot of 88 millihenry toroids and a bunch of capacitors, and trying to figure all that out, which was kind of a different education for me. Fortunately, as part of that, in my as part of the shop class, you could do a work study job in your senior year. Some people were lucky enough to do it in their junior year. I was looking forward to whatever I might want to do in my senior year. And I thought, well, I want to work at the Motorola shop, or maybe I want to work at the GE shop or the county radio shop. And came time to pick, and there were already students placed in those three opportunities. And just by happenstance, as I'm trying to figure out, well, am I going to work at the appliance shop fixing mixers and garbage disposals, which I did for a couple of months in the preceding summer. And says, no, garbage disposals are not for me. A friend of my dad's, who was also in the service with him in the radio business, was the engineer for the local paging and mobile telephone company, which I didn't even know existed. Never heard of that. And Dad and John were having a conversation, and I kind of overheard this. And Dad looked at me and said, well, John's asking where you're going to, what your job is, what your school work study job is going to be. And how he knew about that, I don't know, but he had a relationship with both the radio shops in town. And Dad looked at me and said, have you figured out what you're going to do? And I said, I can't get into the county. I can't get into Motorola. I can't get into GE. And he told that to John. And John said, well, then he's coming to work for me. How do I make this happen? It's all about relationships. And I told him I went to my electronics instructor and he said, how do we sign up a new employer for the work study program? So he went to the principal, to the school board, and said, here's the forms, take them to that employer, have them fill it out to become eligible as a work study opportunity. So I started at that, doing bench work, fixing little Motorola Pageboy 1 tone beepers for doctors and plumbers, which was pretty cool, and got in a little bit of handhelds. I eventually got into the TTL Logic computer, as it were. That was the paging terminal you dialed into, and a bunch of other goofy electronics that the mastermind of this company came up with. They were also the local answering service, so it was a good tie-in between answering the doctor's emergency phone at 3 a.m. and paging them out to various things.
Plus, they had a mobile telephone service too, so they were using like IMTS or C code or something like that.
Yes, we had C code heads tied to GE Master Pro high band radios in the trunk. So I had to do a couple of those installs. That install shop I didn't drive at the time, so somebody always had to take me out to the shop to do somebody's install. Along the way, one of my classmates, his job fell out. He needed a job, so I got him hired. I became the boss of one of my classmates. And I had another friend who was out of school at that time, hired him on for a while. So I always had a ride to work with one of my classmates. And it was a little interesting come first semester grading time when my classmate, we had to submit grading forms, and my boss filled out mine, and I filled out for my student or my classmate. And that paperwork went through the school system. They said, this is not going to work. Why not? I said, call my boss. I am the supervisor of this student. So they went around a little bit, and sure enough, I got to grade my classmates in high school, which was pretty cool. Somewhere about 6 months into that job, as a matter of fact, because of that, because of circumstance, I was the only technical supervisor at the company to do the grading because my dad's friend had taken a transfer out of state to work for Motorola. That left me at 16 years old being the technician for 5 paging and mobile phone sites and the terminal equipment that was tucked in whatever back room and whatever, outlandish city. And, we didn't do the transmitter repair, but I had the numbers of all the Motorola guys say, hey, my quarter kilowatt VHF transmitter at the Eau Claire site's down. Can you run out there and fix it for us? So I was the head engineer for an RCC for a couple of years. It was kind of cool.
And now this message from ICOM America. Got cabin fever? ICOM has the rigs that you need to get into the field or to update your ham shack with a variety of base stations, mobiles, and handhelds. ICOM's newest 2-meter amateur FM transceiver is the ICOM IC V3500 or the V3500. This 65-watt transceiver has a compact body and simple interface. Its features include simple operation with a modern white display, instant volume loud and mute functions, emergency call and alarm features, and a 4.5-watt audio amplifier for loud and crisp audio. The ICOM ICT-10 is a dual-band VHF-UHF rugged portable that meets or exceeds standard military testing in its IP67 waterproof case. The ICT-10 can withstand any field activities ahead of it. Features include extra loud 1500 milliwatt audio amplified speaker, DTMF front-mounted keypad, 5 watts of output power, 11 hours of operating time, and NOAA weather alerts. The ICOM IC7300 is our favorite high-performance innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed every ham's expectations for an entry-level HF transceiver. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package, covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The IC705 features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts when connected to 13.8 volts DC. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. Micro SD card slot, and a speaker microphone, the HM243, which is included in the package. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with room for accessories and your lunch. Designed from user input, the ICOM ID5100A is mobile radio innovation taken to the next level. This rig offers an intuitive user touchscreen interface and connects with Android devices and Bluetooth headsets via the optional Bluetooth module. This mobile rig includes up to 50 watts output power, integrated GPS receiver, DV-DV dual watch, DV-FM repeater list function, D+ reflector linking, and SD card slot for voice and data storage. Finally, the ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band portable with D-Star and FM functionality in a beautiful handheld package. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex repeater regional worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet network. The ID52 features include a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display, VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it is IPX7 waterproof. You can share the Android app for D-Star operation, battery pack, and headsets between the ID52A and your IC705. So there you have it, the wide variety of complementary ICOM transceivers to open up the coming spring SOTA, POTA, contest, DXing, and EMS operation. You can find out more about these fine rigs by clicking on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit an ICOM dealer near you to purchase one or all of these rigs, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. So did you have to get your second-class radio telephone license in order to be able to work on that stuff? I mean, or were you working under somebody else's license?
Mostly because I wasn't doing the transmitters directly. It would have been under the guise of, the local advisors, the local shop. And I did go down to Chicago and try to take my second class at the FCC field office. A totally intimidating experience for a 16-year-old kid, because you've got the guys in the short sleeve white shirts and the pinstripe or the pencil-thin black ties, very strident.
The Tungsol tube plastic pen holder in their breast pocket.
Yeah, and it's like the typical geek engineer, and it was just, I don't know how poorly I did on the test. I later did get my my second class, taking it in Houston some years later. But by the time any of that mattered, I graduated from high school, was working there full time. I knew I wasn't going to go to college for engineering. It just wasn't my thing. It wasn't that strong in math and theory and science. And again, a connection to the Wisconsin School of Electronics. My dad, I got enrolled in the Wisconsin School of Electronics 2-year program, which would have been an AS degree. I could have gone to the county technical college. And about 3 or 4 months into the time at Wisconsin School of Electronics, I was looking around the room at 20 classmates who didn't have a clue about electronics. We were still doing resistors and capacitors 4 months into the class. And here I am, paying for my education, working on new TTL logic control systems for paging. I'm working on telephone switching equipment for the for the mobile phone stuff. The guy who ran the company was a bit of an entrepreneur, and he hired an engineer out of the university to start developing some of the early microprocessor stuff, because we needed to get off the relays and motor switching of the answering service polling scheme. He was one of the first guys to get permission to do third-party interconnect equipment to the Wisconsin telephone system. Now, we couldn't do it in the switching office. We had to have 25 pair run out of the switching office to somebody's basement to do our interface equipment to be able to answer the phones for these doctors and lawyers and stuff. And he saw the benefit that microprocessors were going to be the future, hired this engineer. So when I wasn't working on radio, I was wire wrapping backplanes. I was stuffing circuit boards. I was doing PC board layout. One day, the engineer had to, Bob, the designer engineer, had to leave early, and he was running an assembler situation. He handed me a roll of paper tape. He said, "Would you run this through the machine? We have to reprogram the ROMs to the microprocessor." And that's the first time I realized how can you stuff letters and numbers into an integrated circuit and make it do stuff? This is just a totally foreign concept to me. And so I didn't learn much about computers at that point, but I sort of knew what they were supposed to do, and that blossomed into some other things. But ultimately, I'm working on all this stuff. I'm designing power supplies. I designed and built the power supplies for the 1676 repeater system. I built some of their decoder boards and the control system, started to build my own, and I'm sitting here looking at not all farm boys, but I asked a couple of my classmates at the School of Electronics, I said, "Why are you here? What do you want to do?" And I said, are you a ham? Are you interested in electronics? "Well, no, but my brother's best friend was really technical, and he got a really cool job at IBM after going to school here, and that sounded good to me." I said, "So you've never soldered a resistor on a circuit board? You've never wired a light bulb?" He goes, "No." And I said, I'm not with my peers. I'm not going to get a whole lot out of, there's not going to be any teamwork here. And not because I didn't want to be teamwork, but I was there to get an education, not Elmer people who ran lawnmowers in their spare time. So much to my dad's disappointment, I dropped out, ended up working full time through the RCC business for a while, which was pretty rewarding.
I think it was a fantastic time to be in that business.
It was.
Because of the emerging technologies that were coming into it.
There was a lot of attention on technology at that point because it was before the Sony Walkman. We did have cassette recorders. We went through the transition out of 8-tracks in our cars. But electronics was becoming much more and more, a part of daily life.
Well, beepers, I was talking to one of my guests a week or two ago, beepers became a consumer item. At first, just doctors had them or emergency firemen had beepers. But by the time you got to the Pageboy 2 and the Motorola Spirit and the BPR 2000 digital pagers, this had become a consumer communications industry.
Yes. And people were fascinated. There were people who, just because they could, subscribe to mobile phones. In one of my most daunting installations, I don't remember what the guy's business was, but I don't think it was so much business as a personal accent. He drove I'd never seen this car before, never knew what it was, a De Tomaso Pantera into the shop, which at the time was a $60,000 sports car. He drives this thing into the shop and says, okay, how soon will you be done? And I said, you got to be kidding. What are we supposed to do? And we talked about where to mount things a little bit. And he said, okay, you guys can have at it. He had a ride. He took off. Everybody in the shop just looked at the car, looked at the pile of tools on the bench, looked at the radio and says, I ain't touching that thing. You're the boss.
That was a fiberglass body too, as I recall, was it?
No, it had a metal body. I actually had to drill the 3/8 hole for the Larson antenna mount in the top of it, and I was shaking all the time I did that. Nobody's ever asked me to drill a hole in a $60,000 car before. If I screw this up.
This is $60,000 in 1973.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money.
Yes. And then it came time to mount the control head. And the C-code head was as big as a toaster. And you're in this little sports car with a stick shift. And I said, there's only one place this might go, but there's the ashtray lighter thing kind of in the way. It's a little awkward. And I don't want this thing sticking up. So he's bumping his elbow and all that. So if I could just get the big control cable glob out of the way, it'd be fine. So I called the guy and I said, I really want to mount this right, but I can't get the ashtray out enough to get enough cable in there. And he says, then cut it out. And I said, what? He said, if you have to cut a hole in the center console to get that thing cleanly wired, go ahead and do it. And I'm just flabbergasted. So now I got to drill 4 holes to get the jigsaw blade in there and cut out a 4x4 chunk of the center console of this car to put the control head in. And I was just sweating. And then I called him. I said, it's done. It worked. I called him on his phone. I said, it's done. It's ready to pick up. He said, okay, I'll be over there in about a half an hour. And we just sat around the shop, gripping our chairs, going, we're going to die. We're going to die. The boss is going to be so pissed. This guy's going to look at this car. And we mutilated his beautiful car. And he walked into the shop. He looked at it, sat down, said, oh, it's just perfect for my arm. That spacing is just right. The handset's right there. The dialing, this is great. Thank you very much. And drove off. I was just flabbergasted. So that took away my fear of ever drilling a hole in anything ever again. I will always drill a hole.
For our younger listeners, nobody had phones in their cars in those days, right?
I did. When I got my first car, of course, I was the mobile phone guy, but yeah.
Yeah, but we take it for granted that everybody has a mobile phone, or even in the early cellular days as it was starting to come in, mobile phones were quite expensive. Even in the 80s, I think you spent $3,000-$4,000 for a mobile phone in the back of your trunk.
Or you leased one. But yeah, it was mostly salesmen, realtors, people who were mobile, quite a bit of the time. And so we also offered the portable, walkie-talkie service too. It wasn't exactly full duplex, but we did have that option.
But as a ham in the 70s, though, with the auto patch, we could have the phone in the car.
Yeah.
That nobody else had. So there was a real advantage to being a ham in the 70s with the auto patch capability.
Yeah. Mine wasn't too fancy. I took one of my T43 GGVs, pulled the vibrator out of it, fed it with a 12-volt filament transformer. So I made it an AC chassis, split it up, built a rudimentary controller. There was no ID, but I wanted to do an auto patch, and so I knew telephone interconnect. I figured it out. I built like an 1800 hertz decoder that would latch and unlatch a relay, which was the access to the phone patch. So it was a whistle-up auto patch. And it sat in the garage for a while, and another ham friend said, well, maybe we ought to do something with this. Let's put it on top of my apartment building on campus. So we hauled my little 4-foot rack of T43 GGV up to the rooftop of this guy's apartment building. We didn't know squat about duplexers or antenna or feed line at the time. And in each corner of the building, we stuck up a Ringo Ranger and fed it with RG58. And I had a 15-mile radius 2-meter repeater with a whistle-up auto patch, which just blew everybody away.
And nobody had that in those days.
You didn't do that in your garage. This was for clubs and people with money and all that stuff. So, it was pretty cool for a 16, 17-year-old to, have built his first repeater at that point with an auto patch.
Now, so you find yourself now in California. How did you get to California, and what are you doing there?
Well, it's a very wayward path. One of the local hams saw something in me beyond mobile phones. He worked for a medical instrument company doing field service for blood chemistry analyzers in hospitals. And he knew there was an opening in Chicago, and he said, I'd really like you to, get out of what you're doing here in Wisconsin because there's no future in it, really. Maybe you'd like to try this as a career. So I interviewed, and the service manager in Chicago liked me. He had a good recommendation. So off I ventured to Texas to go to instrumentation school for 3 months on the job. Well, not sort of on the job training, but it was factory school. And I found myself in the first class, well, the whole series of class with guys who were ex-military. And this is another I think a contributing part to electronics and ham radio is the Vietnam War provided a lot more visibility to some military technology and access to it, certainly training for a lot of people. I explored that route, but being colorblind, there were things I couldn't work on. So you're going to go, well, how did he work on electronics anyway if he's colorblind? But I got past that. But the military wouldn't take me. So I show up at this factory training school, and my 6 classmates were either ex-Air Force or ex-Navy A-school grads who'd served on destroyers or, flight lines. And we're going through the exercises in this class, and, you'd learn the schematic. You'd walk through the operation of the system. The instructor would kick you out for a while, go put a bug in your machine, and say, go back to the lab and find your problem. And this is how we learned how to troubleshoot these things. And, I'd get to my machine, look at the schematic, figure out the symptom, go pull a relay out. Yep, the guy taped a contact. That's what fouled the relay. And I take it back to the instructor. And he looked at his watch. He looked at me, and he goes, how are the other guys doing? I said, I don't know. They're still, assholes and elbows in the cabinet trying to figure out what's going on. He says, wait here. And then went back out, put another bug in my machine and said, your machine's broken again. And I went out there and tinkered for about 10 or 15 minutes and came back with a little circuit board or something. And he said, this is not possible. I don't know how you did this. Go help everybody else. So I became a de facto Elmer to guys who had far superior electronics training than I, getting them through the first stage of this class. And that wash, rinse, repeat through 2 or 3 different technologies in class. And the head instructor came to me and says, you got to stop fighting with the instructors. I go, what do you mean? Well, it seems like you're a little contentious. You're taking this as a dare. I said, they're putting me up to it. The fact that it's not my fault I found a problem in 10 minutes and could find the next problem in 10 minutes. He said, well, just take it easy and help everybody else out in class. So I said, okay. But, I got scolded for knowing stuff. And he said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, I worked in a lot of telephone relay logic, which the first generation of this equipment was built out of. So I knew how to read relay schematics, which the guys in the destroyers and the flight line didn't. And the logic, they didn't have logic on a destroyer or, in an ARC 5 transceiver on a C-130. These were things I was exposed to that they weren't. And I did my part of Elmering and helped them through it. So I engaged in that career in field service for a while. Then eventually the idea of working in the training department in education intrigued me. My high school electronics instructor being a role model for me, it just seemed a natural gravitation to, I want to go and teach other people how to do this stuff. So an opportunity came up to sign on to transfer to Houston to the factory as a technical writer. They had a new product coming out, and they figured, well, if anybody can get this technology and help other people with it, we'll get the service manual written for this new book, this new product. So I went down there and did that for a while, hoping to become an instructor. And so I produced a service manual for a new piece, for a new product before the product was running on the assembly line. And the engineering department wanted me to go to work for them, but because I didn't have a double E, they wouldn't do that. The idea of becoming an instructor fizzled out. And another friend locally that I met was with a different kind of instrumentation company and said, why don't you come to work for us? We'll take you into our realm. And that was mass spectrometry, which is used in forensics and defense, petroleum, chemical research, all kinds of deep research things rather than hospital diagnostics. So that was another level of getting into instrumentation and more computer stuff. That company was based out here in California. It was Finnegan Instruments in Sunnyvale. And again, a 3-month stint to come out and do factory training. Went back, did field service, on and off field service for them until I advanced to other products, their German product. I eventually became their field data system specialist. Everything was mini computer, 10-inch, 5-megabyte hard drives, some real archaic stuff, 9-track tapes for recording data. It was kind of fun. I became the guy they flew all over the country when nobody else could figure out how this data system worked on the German instrumentation and everything else. I kind of got burned out of traveling. I'd been doing it for 20 years. And the data system, the tech support expert at the factory was retiring, moving on, left to another company. And the only person they could figure that was going to backfill this guy's position was me. So we arranged a transfer, and I moved out to California in 1989 from Texas.
So you've been here a long time.
Maybe too long as far as some of my background. And it was in Texas that I got to know folks that were part of the Texas or Armadillo intertie system, which was a parallel to Cactus, but not connected yet. But they knew of each other. So I helped those guys build sites and do some work. I served some time as a broadcast engineer there in Houston in between some things. And Houston was also where I looked around my community, and I didn't know anybody in any ham clubs or anything, but I talked to a couple of ham buddies who were on the local volunteer fire department. And I said, what are you guys doing for Aries, Races, or whatever around here? And I said, well, we're not too involved in that, but I do know we need some help with the radios at the fire department. So they hooked me up with one of the captains, and I visited with him for a little bit. And he says, well, yeah, you sound like you know how to work on radios and all that kind of stuff. Why don't you come down and meet the chief? And I'll go over a few things, and everybody thinks you'll be a fit. We'd love to have help with our radios because I'm doing it, but I'm also an ambulance driver. I said, okay. So went down, met the chief. He filled out some paperwork, handed it to me. He says, well, welcome aboard the department. Glad to have your help. Take this form down to the supply closet, and the lieutenant will get you fixed up. I said, cool. I'm going to go get a box of pagers and take it home and help my fire department. And I got downstairs to the supply closet and met the lieutenant. And he said, what's your size? I said, I'm just here to work on radios. That box over there in the corner is probably for me. He says, no, seriously, what's your size? Boots and coat. I went, let's see, I'm an 8.5 and 36 regular. Why? He hands me a set of bunker gear, and he says, where do you live? I said, I'm out in this neighborhood. He said, Engine 25C company, your rig and captain are parked outside the bay. Welcome to the fire service. And I spent 8 years in doing communications and as a volunteer firefighter in 2 departments in Texas.
What city?
This was well, the first one was an area called Alief, which is a suburban area in southwest Houston. The original department was called Alief Community Fire Department. We renamed it the Community Fire Department, and it still stands today. A lot different than it was then. And the second department was Colleyville, which is between Dallas and Fort Worth, both kind of suburban, semi-rural environments.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active, and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. What do you think the greatest lesson that you learned from being a volunteer fireman over that period of time?
I would recommend it to anybody if you've got a chance to risk something and you think you can do it. Now, I'm not a big guy. I never played sports. I was never physically anything, which is why electronics is kind of cool, because soldering irons and resistors don't weigh much. T43 GGVs weigh a little bit, so do base stations.
At our age now, we were careful when we lifted off the bench, but when we were younger, we didn't have to be careful.
Yeah, we didn't care then. It was an interesting experience that I figured, I guess I'll find out if I'm up to this. Now, of course, everybody in the department was, ex-football players or, bigger, stocky or whatever. And there were some older folks. It was a tremendous opportunity, very eye-opening, that I could get into this with my technical skill set, with the ambition, I don't want to call it ambition. I think it was a sense of obligation or service to community that if I couldn't do anything else, if I couldn't write big checks to fund a library, I could at least invest a little bit of labor and time in doing whatever I could for the community. Just give back to, just like all those Elmers and people who facilitated my education and opportunities when I was a kid. There's something I can do to make sure people are safe. Just one of those innate things. It was a tremendous experience.
How did your employer work with the volunteer fire department? I mean, were you called out to major alarm fires during business hours?
Well, at that point, and still to this day, the 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. crew is paid off-duty professional firefighters from other departments. So that was, and if we got a call and we were available, we could go. And being in field service and some other things, my boss, the company, was pretty lenient that if I didn't miss a service call in New Orleans, do what you got to do, catch up. And so that worked out very well. Throughout my career, I've always been with good employers, even in California doing some of the stuff. It worked out pretty well. Yeah, it was a little scary being dragged into that first fully involved two-story at 3 p.m. in Texas heat, 98% humidity. But, when you came out of it and you said, well, we saved the foundation, it's a very exhilarating situation. And in some cases, whether personal injury or other circumstances, it's kind of sad and sobering. There are some of those moments that only firefighters and police officers know, just like the military. It stays with you, and amongst your brothers and sisters what that life is like.
But it makes your life more real.
Yeah. I can't say it's necessarily a religious experience, but it does go. There are things around the house, and my wife will go, "You sure you want to do that?" And I go, "Hold my beer and watch this." It's not a bravado kind of thing, but at least you've got the confidence to go, I've taken on things I never thought I would ever do. So let's try this once. It gives you a, make them tell you no kind of attitude.
I heard a phrase today on a podcast from a friend of mine who's a podcaster, lives just up the street from me, who said that the problem we have these days is we have prosperity without purpose. What do you think about that?
There is a balance there, and I thought about that when I looked at the transition to California, because I'd served on two departments. I was thinking, what am I going to encounter in California? Where my then wife at the time was going, why don't you just worry about working and having a place to live versus any of this other stuff? And I said, because eventually when we get settled, I got to have something to do. From a lot of travel out here, I was aware of the CAL FIRE programs. They use some volunteers on the fire line and in communications. But I had to get settled in the job and everything else. And I didn't do much here except get involved with Cactus and build out a couple of sites with George. And that was very eye-opening.
That's George Zafiropoulos, KJ6VU.
George Zafiropoulos, yeah. Got exposed to, one of the guys I worked with at Finnegan was part of a a local, not quite radio club, but repeater group that was the reportedly the third UHF repeater in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I got associated with those folks, and that brought about a whole community, the whole two-way, and some of the broadcast industry. So I got to know some people, some pretty influential people, significant people who built this stuff very early on when I got here. So I immediately came into a ham community that was welcoming and that I could get involved with. But I knew that I did not want to fight fire here in California. First of all, being in the Bay Area, there weren't a lot of volunteer departments. If we had moved to a place that had volunteers, a lot of that activity is brush fire, wildland work. And my last fire outside of Colleyville, Texas, was about a 600-acre ranch brush fire. Never want to do that work again. That's just brutal. I was just not built for that kind of stuff. So I said, well, being a firefighter out here is out. And eventually, through various career turns, interesting career turns out here, my present wife knew I was looking for something to do, or else she just found this. But there was an advertisement or some outreach that the state of California, the Office of Emergency Services, had some opportunities for volunteer communicators in our region. So she handed that to me and said, here, go do something. And so I called the guy, the local rep, and we chatted for a little bit, gave him a little bit of my background. He said, okay, let's get you signed up. So I got signed up, and once we had all the paperwork done, he called me back. He says, oh, and by the way, you got a promotion. And I go, how did I get a promotion? I haven't even seen a truck or a radio yet. And he said, your background impressed everybody else, and I need a second in charge of the region, and you're it. So I immediately became, the assistant or second of the volunteer communicators for Cal OES in Region 2. And that was probably more what I thought I would be doing when I started my first fire department, is making radios work in what I will call a very serious field day type operation. If CAL FIRE had to go set up a base camp someplace out in the boonies, CAL FIRE didn't have resources. Cal OES was the group that brought in satellite phones, satellite data, deployed the portable repeaters, and supported that operation from that end. If there was a law or other disaster situation, occasionally that would call for resources that were not full-time, all the time, every day kinds of things that communications, professionals and some amateur radio operators who aren't too much into the blinky vest thing could handle, becoming basically what the state considered us as unpaid professionals. You had to have some public safety or similar experience and a sense of the discipline that you are working around grown-ups in the response industry. And that was a very rewarding 12 years I spent with them.
During that period of time in California, the Bay Area's had earthquakes. I think you had the Bay Bridge collapse, right? Was it during that period of time that you were involved in that?
Yes. I relocated here starting in 88, but settled in 89. I got on, I spun the dial on my 2-meter radio going, there's got to be someplace I can help. There's got to be someplace I can help. At least I can offer myself up. And I ran across the Santa Clara County Aries Resource Net, and I said, I'm available. They didn't know me from anywhere. That was before a credentialing system, basically. And I said, send me wherever you want. And so they found an assignment. They said 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, show up at Santa Cruz City Fire Station number 2. That's their emergency city hall, and stand stationed there and just offer whatever communications help that they ask. So I got to drive through earthquake country, the back road, to get there.
This was during the bridge collapse?
No, this is the 89 quake. And so I did that assignment, didn't have to do anything there. One of the very telling discovery moments at that point, because I didn't have anything else to do. I had my UHF radio on. I was talking to a couple guys on the Cactus system, which covered over there. And I realized from what the circumstances were, that there was not a lot of communication between the Greater Bay Area and the coastal region, which was mostly affected. Santa Cruz had a serious building collapse, had a serious supply chain issue. All kinds of things were necessary, and there were only one or two repeaters, if that could leap that mountain range and help out. So I talked to the local cactus guy who was in Santa Cruz. He was affected by all of this. And I said, Tom, is there any way you would consider taking this system off link and offering it to the area's RACES Red Cross activity to support your community? He said, not no, but heck no, and immediately hit the DTMF pad and took the system off the air. And I said, that is never going to happen in my watch again. And so that got me to commit to keeping at whatever it cost me. There will always be a trans Santa Cruz Coastal Range repeater available to anybody who needs it, because of the response I saw out of one curmudgeon ham who did not want his system carrying all that yada yada Aries traffic.
Is that what CalNet is now, or is that something else?
Well, CalNet, I morphed into CalNet after Cactus, and the systems I build here are part of CalNet, and they can be disconnected and stand alone. That's why we do these things, and how we link. Just like how Cactus was built, we can bring them on and bring them off. CalNet is, I'm thinking, the second, maybe the third linked multi-site system in the state of California. There's, of course, Cactus. We've seen the coming and going of Condor, which is a 220 network. The Wind system was third or fourth in that line. There have been a lot of systems, but regardless of whether I'm part of a network, as long as I got a rack of equipment and can find a place to park it, it's going to be available to anybody who needs it, because somebody's going to need it. And as a follow-on, a couple of years later, in 1991, I was off to a radio conference or a computer conference in Las Vegas when the Oakland Hills fire happened. And the Oakland Hills fire is when everybody in the local area, because 13 cities, counties, different agencies had figured out they didn't have unified mutual aid communication system. They didn't even have fire hydrant connections for apparatus from other cities that matched and could be used in other gear. That's what caused the genesis of the standardized emergency management system and mutual aid at many different levels, from physical to technical. The state of California is the genesis of SIMS, or what we know as mutual aid, and now the incident command system. I know a couple of people who are the authors of that program. It's kind of cool. They've come out here and be dropped in the lap and their tender, loving education care with the people who invented these systems that we take for granted today, and how they evolved and why they evolved. So it's kind of phenomenal.
Are you finding younger people to come in and take your place in these volunteer opportunities?
Not at the level, depth, craziness that I've got. There are a lot of folks coming into the hobby with that interest, and I think they come in because of local CERT and community engagement, some part of community service, and they look to do a little bit more and better. And if they're so inclined to get into something organized, they will gravitate to it. Of course, being California, we have a lot of, shall we say, nonconformists that do not want to be part of a disciplined, rigorous group of stuff. They just want to do their own thing, which affects a lot of things out here in communications and technically. A couple of my neighbors got into ham radio sort of because they heard about CERT. In fact, I did some CERT. I created a communications module for our local CERT training, and because of that, at least 3 of my neighbors are now hams. And we spread that to probably 5 or 6 more people in the neighborhood. So my little neighborhood of a couple square miles has got a higher density of ham radio operators than any other neighborhood in our 6 mile square mile community of Campbell, which I think is pretty cool. You know, got all these hams, we don't talk to each other very much, but at least we have 6 hams in.
Are they on the air?
A couple of them are. One of them is active on our UHF system and is part of the Aries group. Another one is a new parent, so he's busy with some of his entrepreneurial work and raising his family. But we're due to get some antennas up in his backyard. The others, we're still working through the CERT communications protocol to get them more adjusted. I said, if nothing else, let's just have a 5 to 9 o'clock Wednesday morning coffee check-in. Just get you used to picking up the radio and saying, "Hi, Mary, it's Becky. What are you doing today? You want to walk the dogs?" Or just get that. I want people to approach radio first from being comfortable with it, as if it was a cell phone with a button on it, so that they're used to it. And once you get a cadence down, I think people will figure this out. They're certainly doing it somewhat in the CERT training, but CERT is not supposed to teach you communications, and that's not the big focus. So that's another challenge I'm working on with the local CERT group, is helping them get more familiar with. Don't be so strident about it. There's only a couple of things that are critical to communicate, and net control protocol is not one of them.
Well, it seems to me, maybe I know this 15th hand, but it seems to me that there's a large number of technician class licensees that are being licensed through CERT programs, but then they are kind of stranded. The theme of the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that comes in March is new amateur radio license, now what? Because I think that there's a lot of people that say, okay, great, I have this piece of paper, but I have no idea what I can do. My neighbor says I should buy a Baofeng radio on Amazon, but once I have it, I don't know how to program it, I don't know what to do, how to talk to other hams. I see this a lot, and I'm just wondering, is that your experience? And if that's your experience, have you guys figured out how to capture these people? And I like the idea of just making them comfortable, even if it is a Baofeng radio on 5.2. What do you think about that?
Well, it's kind of hard to try to force people into it. You want them more comfortable, but they have to wanna. And if the CERT organization tried to make it more of a community involvement than a CERT thing, I think what got them into it owns a piece of that ownership and transition. And because you can't just take a 40-year veteran ham and go, "You got your license, let's get you on the air, let's do something." They don't even know what they want to do. They got it because it was going to help their community, and the community taught them how to, "Mary, this is Jane. Everybody's safe at our house. I've walked the block. Everybody's safe on our block. Okay, Jane, thank you very much." And Roger, over and out. That's not very substantive. There's no continuity. There's no flow from the focus purpose of CERT to community involvement. And if they do it only in terms of the CERT teams and that vacuum, they're certainly not going to throw you at the local DX club right away. They may not even be aware of amateur activity and other uses for this radio other than CERT. They may not perceive it for campouts if they go camping or whatever else. If people are going camping, they're looking at GMRS or FRS radios or something else. So there's that challenge of connecting it to life beyond the purpose built. Just like some of the folks who are involved in doing public service events, walkathons and those kinds of things, if there isn't an interest, a personal investment, a purpose for radio beyond counting water bottles at a relief station on a marathon, there's no gravity, there's no attraction, there's no pull there to do anything with it. They didn't get into it for they didn't get into it for radio. They got into it for the purpose-built communication.
It seems to me that the problem is in the training, the amateur radio training. Like if a person is getting an amateur radio license through a CERT program, then what seems to be missing in that training is saying, oh, by the way, we're talking about the hobby of amateur radio, and that this license that you're about to earn this weekend actually has implications that go much farther than counting bottles at a walkathon.
Yeah, that's the connection that needs to happen. If there's that kind of ham that's teaching that, But the CERT itself does not include a communications module, does not include a license. It's something that, okay, once you graduate from CERT Academy, I mean, they may talk about you will use your radios. It's part of the final test or final exercise, but the focus is so much on CERT that I don't think the PR level of amateur radio, now that you're involved in this, do you know what else you can do with it? Would be a distraction. You know, it might come as a distraction. It might not be in the interest of CERT. Though that's what I try to do with the locals here is say, I want you guys to be happy and friendly with this. Don't wait for the quarterly exercise to go to the park and hang yellow flags. You know, let's use this around the neighborhood, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the neighborhood we want to know of, and some of that stuff doesn't. People gravitate towards Nextdoor or Facebook for their neighborhood activities, or the Reddit group or their groups.io, and that's not very friendly. You know, we used to walk out in the front yard, and I still do with a couple of my neighbors. We meet at the mailbox, or you know, we know somebody's having a party, and we go over and say, "Hey, Tony, here's a bottle of wine to add to your party." Well, come on in. That's the kind of community thing that. How do you extend that to radio? But that's what I want to do, is step out in your front yard, look at your neighbor, go help them pick up a bag of leaves, you know, tell them you'll watch the cat when they go on vacation, you know, be that community. And that's not what's happening. We're not much of a community or neighborhood anymore in a lot of cases. And so why would I want to spend $60 on a radio to push a button to talk to my neighbors who I don't even say hi to when I go out and check my mail?
Are there still neighborhood watch programs?
Not here.
I'm dating myself.
I haven't heard that term I haven't heard that term in a long, long time, and maybe there will be a resurgence of it at some level. I think neighborhood watch has become sort of a Karen watch on Nextdoor, the social media service, more than anything else. There is a great deal of concern now that many of the California communities have encrypted their police radio systems and some of their fire systems for victim and suspect privacy concerns and all this kind of stuff. So I used to have 3 scanner streams here at the house, broadcasting all the fire stuff on one of them, all the local law enforcement on another, and then whatever special incidents on a third. And when the local community flipped the switch to go digitally encrypted, the community lost access to real-time what's happening at Main and 4th. You know, why are there 7 cops here at the shopping center? You know, and that has now gone to that traffic, those queries have now gone to Nextdoor, and it's 3 days later before anybody finds out that, you know, there's a felony traffic stop for a bank robber at your local, you know, grocery store, you know, parking lot. So I don't know if some communities are much stronger with their neighborhood associations and community watch. Ours was very strong as we were a neighborhood in the county before the city of San Jose wanted to annex us, and we fought very, very hard to get our other preferred local community to annex us. And that's when you learn how government works. It's not pretty, but we succeeded, and we thought we were very tight. We thought, well, you know, now we have a voice and we have somebody local and familiar to talk to. Maybe we can get some things done in the community, traffic and the likes of that. And that just didn't happen. The city was not resourced enough to really address this, unless we pushed them. I guess we could have really pushed them as much as we did the other argument, but I think we were pretty exhausted from fighting the city of San Jose. We didn't want to fight with our new hometown.
This is very interesting. It brings all kinds of interesting thoughts to mind. If you take out the volunteers, you encrypt the radios so that your scanner enthusiasts, but there was a fair number of them, that people have a sense of what's actually happening in their town, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've turned it all over to the professionals. They don't know what's happening anymore. They're not doing neighborhood watch, so they're not walking their own neighborhoods to know what's happening in terms of, oh, yeah, Mr. Jones has 30 meters of chain link fence missing today. I wonder what happened. Why is it missing? Does he know that it's missing? It seems like these are things that used to be part of communities where people actually, they knew their neighbors and they had all this stuff. So you see this evolution of all of these neighborly things are being outsourced to the local government, perhaps, to the police, to the fire, to whatever. Volunteerism is down. People aren't a part of their communities. The government changes their funding, so they reduce the budgets of law enforcement and stuff like this. And so, in a way, you kind of don't know what's happening in your town. You don't know if you're going to walk into a liquor store that's being held up because you didn't hear it on your scanner. I don't know. It seems like this creates a very... I apologize to my audience that I'm going off on this tangent, because you're all of a sudden you're kind of crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's on things I've been thinking about in other areas like infrastructure in terms of lack of expertise. As we get older, the experts are getting out of infrastructure and people just assume that everything just works. And I think this is also the same thing, is we assume our communities just work and we don't have to be involved with our hands in the dirt anymore because we're relying on somebody else. We're not sure who that is, but we're relying on someone.
Yes, and I find this from the Midwest, where you almost can't get your neighbors out of your business sometimes. But if they see your lawnmower stalled, hey, come, Fred, come on over and borrow mine. It's just a thing. I grew up with, I'll go over and whether it's borrowing a cup of sugar or the tractor mower, or you need something welded on the back of your hitch or something. There are people to do that, and they don't ask for money. Maybe it's a 6-pack of beer, or you give them a gift certificate at Christmas time, and it's just community. A lot of that, maybe not so much in some parts of the East Coast, but other parts out east I've experienced, just even through work experience, have been very community oriented. I found that a great deal with the communities I was involved with in Texas. That allowed me, as it only took about 3 weeks for everybody to stop calling me a damn Yankee when I got to Texas, because they realized I knew the difference between a cow and a sheep, and which one you milked and all that. Because I didn't act like I was from the Northeast. I didn't act like I was somebody else. I just acted like a human being. That was my nature. And coming to California, and the Bay Area, the larger metropolitan areas, sophisticated areas, if you want to call it that, have a different culture, have a different human interaction than if you go to the agricultural areas, the ranching areas in the Central Valley, where people do help each other out because that's the community. In Silicon Valley, when I first got exposed here, there were still orchards very close to my backyard here. There was an orchard in the middle of Sunnyvale, Silicon Valley, heart of tech. There were orchards that are now, big housing developments. So there was rural agricultural activity in Silicon Valley before it all got pushed out, however that happened. So I initially felt pretty comfortable, coming to California because I knew people here. And I knew people that were, like-minded and generous with their time and giving a helping hand. And in over the course of time, almost everything changes. Things morph with society, with technology. I think the trend of cell phones and being in your own little bubble greatly affects amateur radio. And not that it prevents people from getting involved in amateur radio, but a lot of what I see of new people coming on is more the device in hand, the gadget, than it is the wire that talks to Italy or Germany or Puerto Rico or whatever else. We've got myriad cheap handheld radios. When people realize that a 5-watt analog Bofang will not talk to Italy, then they learn about, there's this cool Raspberry Pi thing that I can plug into the internet, and a digital radio. I like digital stuff. They grab onto a Pi-Star hotspot and get a DMR ID, just like they get an ID, a name on Reddit or Twitter. Suddenly they finally get it to work somehow, and they're now working Italy from their living room on a 2-watt radio, not realizing that that's a Skype call.
It's $1 trillion worth of infrastructure in order to make that ham radio connection.
Yeah. You did not work Italy. You talked to somebody in Italy that you could have randomly called up on Skype or, whatever, done a conference through Facebook Messenger. And not to belittle that, it gets you out of, it gets you out of your backyard. But there are a lot of technical concerns with that. And one we've seen here, and since I'm so engrossed in the repeater community and spectrum management here as president of the local coordination body, we occasionally, anecdotally or occasionally, hear of folks that are, there's all this digital noise on the input of my repeater, the output of my repeater. How do I track this down? And you come to find out that somebody has taken one of these hotspots and without being aware of a band plan, a concerted frequency cooperation, these guys, if it stayed in their garage, it would be fine. But they've determined, I want more range, so I want to ride my bike around the neighborhood and still talk to Italy. So they'll take this $50, $100 device with an SMA connector on the top of it. They'll have looked on Facebook or some group and said, I have to get me some of this LMR 400 coax and some kind of antenna. I'll get a roll-up J-pole or something and put it on my roof, and I'll extend the range of my hotspot. That only makes it worse because it's digital stuff that, there's no easy way for the human ear and analog to know, is that a DMR signal? Is that a Yaesu Fusion? Is that D-Star? Is it P25? What is that? And then figuring out how you're going to identify it, who it is, how you're going to decode it. So tracking down interference of these little rogue devices is a new challenge in our spectrum use. Bravo for folks taking their familiarity with devices and technology and moving it the next step to getting out of the garage. You're getting off your internet provider, but you're not, into radio. Now we have to go teach. They got their tech. However they did it, online study, whether they joined a club or something. But now we have to teach them the stuff that they tested for. And this brings to mind something that a common communication thread that's going on is, are you a ham once you get your license, or do you get your license to become an amateur radio operator? And there's a big difference about that because very, very few people come into the hobby with a in-depth technical knowledge of radio and communication systems and decide to add an amateur radio license onto that experience to practice it for pleasure and casually. Getting your license lets you do all the things to get more experience and training and hands-on with it. So that's something the ARRL is talking about, that kind of approach. More people I see on some of the Facebook forums and things are starting to take that approach. Is getting your license is not the accomplishment, it's the first page of the book.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. I see from what you're saying that creating local community of hams, of new licensees, led by experienced hams, I mean, you could find that interference problem if you've got a ham in your group that says, I just extended the range of my hotspot by putting up a 30-foot mast and, it's in a plastic box at the top of the mast. I mean, it seems to me that those were the kinds of things that we had when we were kids, is that we had mentors around us because we were not internationally connected in terms of, we couldn't get internationally connected unless we had those mentors. So it seems to me that there's a lot of things that could be solved if there was some way to corral those new licensees in the local area to solve a whole bunch of different problems on the one hand, and also provide them with a community that I think that probably a lot of people seem to feel like maybe they lack now, belonging to something and being significant to another group of people because of who they are and what they can contribute.
Yeah, I think the interesting thoughts developing is with so many people getting their license online, there's no community support for them. You don't know if you're on hamstudy.org and then you sign up for an exam, you may be in an exam session with somebody from, you're in Tennessee, your examiner is one of the proxies is in Texas, the other's in California, and another one's in Oregon. They're probably not so inclined to say, oh, where are you? Let me look up a ham club that once you pass your test, you should go look up and get involved with to make the most of this new license you got. So there's a handoff from the study to the exam to now what do you do? And the more we remote that and distance that from the local community, that makes it even harder to capture new folks. When my wife went through her licensing class, there was offered a follow-up Saturday. So now you have your license, now what? To walk people through, go get your radio off Amazon, bring it to this class. We'll help you program it, and we'll get you familiar with it. And then you were released into the wild, probably without any reference to a local ham club. And I'm thinking whether the ARRL does it or I do it, we start a Bay Area New Hams Club, the goal of which is to give people a place to come and bond and get through those first few stages with some people who are experienced enough with HF antennas and hotspots. And, there's a lot of technology to cover. And with the expressed intent and goal and advice right up front that says the goal of this club is not for you to be a permanent member. The goal of this club is to, in 2 years, send you off and kick you out of the club because you're accomplished, you're self-sufficient, you may come back as an instructor or a mentor, but the goal of this club is not to be a perpetual place, for you to exist. And that, I think, some local clubs, if they're in a tight community, probably offer that Elmer night or that training night. I'm not seeing a lot of that. I started my Elmer's group on Facebook because there weren't any Elmering groups. I'm not the biggest group anymore. I was the only for a while. And I did it specifically because when you looked at the senior ham radio forums on Facebook, you got a lot of, that question was asked 9 months ago. Go back and look at the history of the group. The answer is there already. That and other off-putting things said, this is not nice. And one of the things I realized immediately, and I have this way of thinking of things sometimes that is a little strange. I said, imagine, my analogy to that is, and I work in a lot of analogies, is say you're the 9th grade geometry teacher in high school. You've been teaching for 10, 20 years. Every year you get a new class. On your 15th year of teaching, the first week, somebody in class asks about a formula for a triangle. And the teacher has the audacity to say, I covered that in my first week as a teacher 15 years ago. Go back and I'm not going to answer that now. I've already answered that question.
Go ask your older brother.
How far do you think that geometry teacher is going to get in their teaching career if they referred every class back to their first time presenting the material, which is not searchable, which is, not in context, probably not even using the same textbook. But imagine a teacher telling you, I'm not going to teach that again. I already taught that course 10 years ago.
I think we also may assume, if we have that attitude, that people actually know how to ask the question in Google or on YouTube, how to ask the question to actually get to the right material. I'm an IT support guy, and I understand that you are too. And I tell people, look, what I can do better than most people is I know how to Google. Because of my experience, I know what question to ask to get the answer, and then I know how to wade through a lot of garbage in order to find the right answer. And most people don't because they don't have the breadth of experience. It's not their interest. Radio terms they've never heard before. What's a resonant antenna? What does that mean, resonant antenna? My father has a resonant voice. What does that mean? I see a lot of social media questions where people they don't know how to ask the question because they didn't go deep enough in their studies. That's not their fault. To know what it is they're really asking when they're asking for help. Maybe what they just want is a friend that could say, let me take you under my arm and help you.
Yeah. And the glaring part of that is not only do they not know how to ask the question or what question to ask, but that's not a matter of fault. That's a matter of circumstance. And that's the first thing to address. The off-putting, the bad part of that is how people react to go, you asked the wrong question. Or, again, we've answered that question before. And I think what helps me have a perspective, whether it's unique or not, I'm not really sure. It seems to work for me in a lot of cases, is that I was very young, working around a bunch of experts, and I didn't know to ask the wattage of a resistor from the ohmic value of a potentiometer and what's the difference between a resistor and capacitor. I had to learn those. I learned those things by myself, or I was too shy to ask the question. I just shut up and watched until I went, oh, the answer appeared. But I was surrounded by smart people who would help me. And then throwing myself at a relatively young age into a definite face-to-face customer service role where I'm taking on a new piece of equipment that was not native to me in my childhood, a piece of hospital equipment, and having to grab that tool bag and the box of parts and walk into that first hospital lab and go, hi, I'm your new high cell service representative, and I'm here to help. And the lab supervisor grabs you by the collar and says, it's broken, go over there and fix it. You got to learn how to be customer service really quick. And when you start recognizing in a lot of cases that this is something maybe somebody could have fixed by themselves without putting in a service call and gotten another 8-hour shift of patient data processed without backing up the whole lab or whatever else is going on. So I found myself teaching, I'd find out what the skill level of somebody in the lab was and say, I can teach you how to fix this before I get here. Are you interested? Yeah, do that for me.
Or at least do the level 1 support, right?
Yeah.
Make sure it's plugged in. Make sure that the switch is turned on.
And then some of these people knew that because part of operator class was the basics of is the breaker for the air compressor, pushed in. But some of the little mechanical pockety queep things that you just needed an Allen wrench and another bracket for or something. So, and also even ahead of making that visit is phone triage. Your boss calls up and says, hey, Helen at St. Mary's has got a problem with the glucose, calibration, whatever. Can you give them a call? Okay. The last thing I want to do is I got a hot weekend date going on here. The last thing I want to do is have to jump in my car on Friday night, tell my date I'll see you on Monday. No, you won't. I'm gone. And, driving 300 miles to go fix something you could have fixed over the phone. And that persisted, through many, many years of physical field service. Can I avoid getting on that airplane? And then definitely into PC support. And myself, okay, you start getting into PCs, you get into online forums, you get into the source. So I've been part of the social media world since 1985, 84, 85. And I've seen it progress in not only different technologies, but not so much in how people behave and treat each other and intercommunicate with some newbies. So take that customer service skill, apply it to online, apply it to a product you're trying to design, apply it to the dialogue boxes of the product you're presenting on screen, and go from there. And then come back full circle to amateur radio and go, I was that dumb kid. I still am that dumb kid. There are a lot of questions that come up. I mean, I don't think that everybody is really an expert at all things in amateur radio or nuclear physics. There are people who focus their entire career on professional antennas and can do a good or bad job explaining them if presented with it. There are people who know every nuance of every power amplifier tube in the business, but a lot of those folks are also smart enough to go, I don't know how to answer that question, but here, let me refer you to an article, a paper, a resource that does. So rather than try and eat the whole elephant or the whole whale as a supposed expert, humility's got to kick in at some point and say, I'm not the expert in that field. I can help you tune the Motorola radio, but I don't know anything about the microprocessor and the controller. Defer, help somebody out.
I think, Jim, we also don't realize how brave a person is who has a new license, who enters an amateur radio forum for the first time as a newbie, and they want to ask an intelligent question. So the fact that they ask any question, I always think those guys are like, oh, yeah, well, okay, so they've jumped over the precipice, perhaps looking stupid or foolish, not knowing which they look like.
They've obviously risked themselves out of their comfort zone, which is very laudable, yes.
That's right. To ask the question and then to have somebody say, well, what a stupid question that is, or you should have been here 2 years ago when we actually had that discussion.
Yeah. I like to grab a lot of those and, excellent question. I think I know what you're asking. And without presuming too much, you got to be careful you're not overstepping. But in a lot of cases, depending on the terms used, what that person's asking because they were fed it from someplace else. The SWR question or the impedance or the loss or the grounding question, you can see where it's going to go, but you can't take them there right away. You've got to acknowledge the question. You've got to ask them questions to get them thinking about the construct of the shack, how to articulate. So I'm going to teach you how to articulate your way through the real problem and engage you in the troubleshooting process. I'm going to make you troubleshoot your own problem, but I'm going to give you the reference points to learn as you go along.
We have the advantage of doing IT support where you're working with all kinds of people on a technical product. If you're like me, we're taking calls all day long from our clients and their employees that have no idea how whatever it is that we're supporting, how it works, why it works that way. Why do I have to turn it off? Why can't I leave my laptop turned on, folded up, and on the bed overnight? What's the problem with that?
Which one is the any key? It says press any key to continue, and I can't find it on my keyboard. I have a Mac, Does a PC have an any key? No. I'm very sensitive to that. Worse is when you see all the bad answers come up ahead of you getting there and go, do I want to jump into this? Well, the person's not getting the question answered. I don't want to acknowledge or start anything because of the 4 bad answers before. I don't want to challenge that person and get trolled. You have to forget you saw those first 4 really rude bad answers and go, hey, Steve, what radio have you got? What's your antenna look like? You got to walk them through just like you've never seen the other answers. And hopefully the guy will come back and not be put off by everybody else, Or while you're in the middle of typing that really nice, polite, inquisitive, here, let me help you, all of a sudden, comment deleted. Oh, crap, the guy gets so upset. He just killed his question because somebody trolled him 7 times. And that's just not a nice way to treat people.
Especially since we're complaining our numbers are dwindling. We're aging out, and therefore, where are all the kids or where are all the young new hams? We now have the ability to turn them off instantly. At least when we were kids, we weren't turned off instantly. We actually had to go to our local radio club to get abused by old people.
Oh, yeah.
Now they can do it to us instantly.
I don't know the demographics. We're gaining people, but are those people as effective as they thought they were going to be, as they wanted to be? Are they engaged and as interested, as they were with, okay, did they come into this reluctantly? Okay. My deal with my wife getting her license was a bargain. She was an avid backpacker, and the side note, I can go off in all kinds of tangents, can't I? When we started dating, she said, "I hope you're not one of those clingy boyfriends." And I said, "Why? What's going on?" And she said, "Well, because I'm part of a backpacking group, and every month we go out on a big long hike. So I'll be gone a weekend a month. I hope you don't mind. And little gleam in my eye said, "That's my radio site weekend." "Yes, dear, I love you. Thank you very much." Yeah, we played together separately. So, every Friday, guys, let's load up the truck. Let's go to the hill. Let's go do something. And so that's worked out very well. And eventually she said, "Well, you need to come on a backpacking trip with me." And I said, "Then you need to get your ham radio license." No, that's not how this is going to work. I go, "Yeah, that's how it's going to work." Eventually, I went on the backpacking trip. It was very interesting. It wasn't unpleasant. It wasn't a gorgeous view, but it wasn't unpleasant. And we packed our stuff back in the car, and I said, "All right, I'm going to sign you up for the next ham cram. You're going to get your license." And eventually, through some other events and everything, she eventually did get her license. I got her a vanity call sign that she could not ever possibly forget what her call sign is. And she will begrudgingly use the radio if I hand her one. And I'm teaching her how to log contacts on HF when we're driving down the road with our RV. So I'm teaching her to log, and eventually she was really big about, should we get one of these Garmin satellite things in case we run off into the woods and can't make contact? And I said, "We can send email from the truck." No, not cellular. I said, "We have WinLink and a PC. We can send email from the truck." So I've got to teach her how to do that too. So, look at everything as an opportunity to do something better than make it a challenge.
Jim, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This has been really swell. I've had a great time, and I really appreciate your having this conversation with me. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thanks. You got me very cranked up, as you might be able to tell, and we'll share this around, because I think this is a great venue to just get to know hams that we might not ever meet in a club meeting, but we'd sure like to if we could get to a ham fest. It's been great. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jim. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in NO1PC in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo and how to get to the ticketing. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.